Communism. An economic and political system based on one-party government and state ownership of property. Containment. The blocking of another nation's attempts to spread its influence, especially the efforts of the United States to block the spread of Soviet influence during the late 1940s to early 1950s. Satellite nations. A country that is dominated politically and economically by another nation. Iron Curtain. A phrase used by Winston Churchill in 1946 to describe the imaginary line that separated communist countries in the Soviet bloc of Eastern Europe from the countries in Western Europe. Truman Doctrine. A U.S. policy announced by President Harry Truman in 1947 of providing economic and military aid to free nations threatened by internal or external opponents. Marshall Plan. The program proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947, under which the United States supplied economic aid to European nations to help them rebuild after World War II. Berlin Airlift. A 327-day operation in which U.S. and British planes flew food and supplies into West Berlin after the Soviets blockaded the city in 1948. NATO. Military alliance created in 1949 made up of 12 non-communist countries including the United States that support each other if attacked. Warsaw Pact. A military alliance formed in 1955 by the Soviet Union and its Eastern European satellites. John F. Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, was in office during the Bay of Pigs invasion, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the building of the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall. A concrete wall that separated East Berlin and West Berlin from 1961 to 1989, built by Communist East German government to prevent its citizens from fleeing to the West. Joseph Stalin, Soviet leader following World War II, dies in the middle of the Korean War in 1953. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet leader from 1955 to 1964, responsible for putting missiles in Cuba. Domino Theory. The idea that if a nation falls under communist control, nearby nations will also fall under communist control. United Nations. An international organization formed after WWII to promote international peace, security, and cooperation. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Quote by Reagan during the war. Causes for the Soviet Union collapse. Increased military spending, rising nationalism in republics, glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost. Soviet policy meaning openness. Perestroika. Soviet term meaning economic restructuring. Foreign policy under George H.W. Bush. Reunification of Germany, First Gulf War, collapse of Yugoslavia. Appeasement. A policy of making concessions to an aggressor in the hopes of avoiding war, associated with Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's policy of making concessions to Adolf Hitler when Hitler was building up his military and taking back lands lost after WW1. Axis powers. Alliance of Germany, Italy, Japan. Allied powers. Alliance of Great Britain, Soviet Union, United States, and France during World War II. Invasion of Poland. Germany invaded them, breaking their agreement, so Britain and France declared war, starting World War II. Adolf Hitler. German Nazi dictator during World War II, Nazi leader and founder, had over 6 million Jews assassinated during the Holocaust. Benito Mussolini. Italian fascist dictator. Joseph Stalin. Bolshevik revolutionary, head of the Soviet Communists after 1924 and dictator of the Soviet Union from 1928 to 1953. He led the Soviet Union with an iron fist, using 5-year plans to increase industrial production and terror to crush opposition. The Battle of Britain is the name given to the air campaign waged by the German Air Force against the United Kingdom during the summer and autumn of 1940. The objective of the campaign was to gain air superiority over the Royal Air Force. Cash and carry policy adopted by the United States in 1939 to preserve neutrality while aiding the Allies. Britain and France could buy goods from the United States if they paid in full and transported them. Lend-Lease policy. A law passed in 1941 that allowed the United States to ship arms and other supplies without immediate payment to nations fighting the Axis powers. Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Theater. The war in the Pacific, most islands were involved. Japan tried to take these islands and sent 65 bombing raids all the way to of Australia. The Holocaust. Neutrality Acts 1939. Laws designed to keep the U.S. out of future wars. D-Day. Concentration camps. Prison camps used under the rule of Hitler in Nazi Germany. Conditions were inhuman and prisoners, mostly Jewish people, were generally starved or worked to death or killed immediately. Death camps. Camps used under the rule of Hitler in Nazi Germany for the purpose of killing prisoners immediately. Many times they were side by side to a concentration camp. Women worked in factories. During WWII, women worked in factories producing munitions, building ships, airplanes, in the auxiliary services as air raid wardens, fire officers and evacuation officers, as drivers of fire engines, trains and trams, as conductors and as nurses. Division of Germany. Creation of United Nations. The United Nations is an intergovernmental organization to promote international cooperation, a replacement for the ineffective League of Nations. The organization was established on October 24, 1945 after World War II in order to prevent another such conflict. February 1945 Yalta Conference. Containment. A U.S. foreign policy adopted by President Harry Truman in the late 1940s, in which the United States tried to stop the spread of communism by creating alliances and helping weak countries to resist Soviet advances. The term was coined by George Kennan. Truman Doctrine. First established in 1947 after Britain no longer could afford to provide anti-communist aid to Greece and Turkey, it pledged to provide U.S. military and economic aid to any nation threatened by Soviet forces or communism. Marshall Plan. Berlin Airlift. A military operation in the late 1940s that brought food and other needed goods into West Berlin by air after the government of East Germany, which at that time surrounded West Berlin, had cut off its supply routes. Iron Curtain. A term popularized by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to describe the Soviet Union's policy of isolation during the Cold War. The Iron Curtain isolated Eastern Europe from the rest of the world. Its most poignant symbol was the Berlin Wall. Cold War. Operation Neptune. Military landing on the 5 beaches of Normandy, France. Operation Overlord. Military Battle of Normandy. Operation Fortitude North. Allied deception pointing to an invasion of Norway. Operation Fortitude South. Allied deception pointing to an invasion of Pas-de-Calais. Operation Skye. Fake military chatter to support Operation Bodyguard. officially ended the Great Depression. Full employment due to mobilization of the economy for WW2. July 1945 Potsdam Conference. Post-war official meeting of Churchill, Truman and Stalin to divide up and begin reconstruction of Germany. It also laid out the terms for Japanese surrender. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to Austrian throne from 1896, assassinated on June 28, 1914 during goodwill mission in Sarajevo, Bosnia by Serbians, sparking WWI caused Germany and other Austro-allies to declare war on Serbia and its allies. Triple Entente, an alliance between Great Britain, France and Russia in the years before WWI. Alliances. Political militaristic pact between nations. Trench warfare. Fighting with trenches, mines, and barbed wire. Horrible living conditions, great slaughter, no gains, stalemate used in WWI. No man's land. During World War I, area between the trenches of opposing aides on the Western Front. Propaganda. Information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Armistice. An agreement made by opposing sides in a war to stop fighting for a certain time, a truce. Schleiffen Plan. German military strategy during WWI to avoid a war on two fronts, concentrated troops in the west to quickly defeat the French and then, if necessary, rush those troops to the east to face the Russians before they could fully mobilize. Unrestricted submarine warfare. A policy that the Germans announced on January 1917 which stated that their submarines would sink any ship in the British waters. Treaty of Versailles. 14 points. The war aims outlined by President Wilson in 1918, which he believed would promote lasting peace, called for self-determination, freedom of the seas, free trade, anti-secret agreements, reduction of arms and a League of Nations. Reparations. Payments for war damages made to winning countries by defeated ones. Gavrilo Princip, member of the Black Hand, shot Austrian Archduke Ferdinand and wife June 28, 1914 set off WWI. Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, known for World War I leadership, created Federal Reserve, Federal Trade Commission, Clayton Antitrust Act, progressive income tax, lower tariffs, women's suffrage, Treaty of Versailles, sought 14 points post-war plan, League of Nations, won Nobel Peace Prize. Lusitania, a British passenger ship that was sunk by a German U-boat on May 7, 1915. 128 Americans died. The sinking greatly turned American opinion against the Germans, helping them move towards entering the war. Czar Nicholas II. Czar Nicholas II. Russian Tsar during WWI, unpopular with Russian people, overthrown in March 1917, executed by Bolsheviks after November Revolution. U-boat. The German submarines used in the Atlantic to sink ships carrying war materials. Trench foot. Isolationism. A policy of avoiding political or military involvement with other countries. Militarism. A political orientation of a people or government to maintain a strong military force and to be prepared to use it aggressively to defend or promote national interests. Balkan Region. Includes the countries Serbia, Austria-Hungary, Greece, Bosnia, and was known as the powder keg because all of the different ethnic groups had a lot of tension between them. Nationalism. Pride for your country. Imperialism. A stronger nation taking over a weaker nation. Totalitarianism. Taking total control over a country. Economic depression. Long-term downturn in economic activity characterized by high rate of poverty. David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister during WWI. Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France during WWI.